Welcome to the Diversity and Inclusion on Air podcast. This podcast is a program of the American Association of Veterinary Medical Colleges Diversity Matters Initiative. The podcast explores various issues related to diversity and inclusion in the veterinary profession and provides the AAVMC an opportunity to offer ongoing diversity programming to our member institutions, as well as all veterinary professionals. My name is Dr. Lisa Greenhill. I'm the Senior Director for Institutional Research and Diversity at the AAVMC. So today, we're talking about leadership in the midst of crisis, and specifically diversity and social justice crises. Now, I could certainly talk about all the crises that veterinary leaders have to navigate, and there's certainly no shortage of those. But I do want to be pretty specific in narrowing the scope to some really kind of sadly high profile, kind of gone virtual nationally or even globally crises. Over the last few years, we've seen numerous, of course, shootings of unarmed BIPOC folks by law enforcement and certainly some others. Some of these events have happened near AAVMC member institutions. So for example, Alton Sterling was killed in Baton Rouge, not far from LSU, Andrew Brown in North Carolina earlier this year, and of course, Philando Castile and George Floyd, both near St. Paul, Minnesota. We've seen how these events have kind of shook the surrounding communities, and certainly we're all aware of just how big the protests last year surrounding the death of George Floyd became in particular. Now, last year, I reached out to my guest after the murder of George Floyd, as I'm sure many others did, to just ask, is there anything I could do to help? And also just to see how she was holding up. This year, as the Chauvin murder trial concluded and we were all awaiting a verdict, I reached out again. How you doing? You ready? Kind of everybody's bracing, only to find that, yeah, they were still bracing. Pandemic still going on. And oh, by the way, they're in the middle of their COE visit, a really easy day at the office. So, clearly folks are still juggling daily life. They're juggling the pandemic. And then these things just are happening that aren't necessarily directly veterinary related, but they're people related, right? And so they're just kind of affecting people in the academic environment. So to talk about all of this, I'm pleased to welcome my special guest, Dr. Laura Molgaard, the Dean of the University of Minnesota's College of Veterinary Medicine. Welcome, Laura. How are you?
I'm great. Thanks for having me.
Like after saying all that, I'm like, how are you? But
how are you really?
Yeah, how are you really? So Laura, before we kind of dive into our topic, why don't you share a little bit about yourself?
So I am the Dean at the University of Minnesota College of Veterinary Medicine, as you said, and I've been in this role officially since June of this year, so just a few months, but I had been interim Dean for almost 2 years prior to that. So that's my recent background. Before that, I was Associate Dean for Academic and Student Affairs, so working closely with students and faculty for almost, I think 18, 19 years. And before that, more heavily involved in teaching, not administration, with a little bit of clinical practice sprinkled in there along the way in primary care general practice.
Great, awesome. So I've known you for quite a few years now, yeah. And I just love the work that you've done, and just so great to work with. So I'm really glad to have you on the show.
Thank you.
So welcome. So you all have experienced quite a bit in the last
oh my goodness, yeah.
years. And certainly things seem to reach a pretty fevered pitch last year after the death of George Floyd. So can you, tell us just a little bit about what that was like from the vantage point of a dean of a vet school?
Absolutely. Yeah, it was obviously a really, really hard time for lots of people. And I thought it was important to recognize not only internally through self-awareness, but externally through my communications, that we weren't all experiencing that trauma the same way. While everybody in the local community was in some ways in it together, it was very clear to me that my experience was not at all the same as the experience of somebody who perhaps lived closer to downtown Minneapolis, Lake Street area, and certainly different than folks in the BIPOC community who were a part of the College of Veterinary Medicine or experiencing that differently. And so that was one of the things that I really wrestled with, was how do I effectively communicate as the college's leader, but not represent myself as having the same experience that everybody else within our community was having.
Yeah.
So that was a lot of the kind of internal struggling that I was having at the time, and why I reached out to others for help.
Yeah, because I can imagine that. I mean, this was a major traumatic event.
Right.
College had actually experienced something similar.
Yeah.
Just a few years ago with Philando Castile, and he was killed much closer to the school.
Much closer. Yeah. I think that when you last visited, I think we drove by there, right? Yeah. So Philando Castile was killed just blocks from the College of Veterinary Medicine. And that was its own very different, disorienting experience for people who haven't spent any time in the Minneapolis-St. Paul area. These are called the Twin Cities. So St. Paul and Minneapolis are together make up the Twin Cities. And the vet school is on the St. Paul campus, and the rest of the health sciences part of the university are on the Minneapolis campus. But Philando Castile was killed so close to the College of Veterinary Medicine, which is just, although it was a much less, there was less public outcry at that time, certainly less national and international attention. That was, that hit close to home in a different way. Yeah.
So do you feel like, last year that it not only was it kind of happening again, but then it just blew up in such a incredible way that I only can imagine what faculty, staff, and students even were just, kind of reeling.
Yeah, definitely. The focus on George Floyd's murder was so much more intense everywhere, including locally.
Yeah.
Certainly, obviously in the Twin Cities, but locally at the College of Veterinary Medicine.
Yeah. How did COVID complicate things?
Well, yeah, COVID complicates everything. Especially back then, the way these are hard conversations to have, but when we don't have really the opportunity to physically get together to have conversations, that adds to the complexity. And back then, our veterinary medical center and our veterinary diagnostic lab folks were on campus working really throughout the pandemic, but the rest of us were required to be remote at that point. And so all communication, at least around these events, was through email or, occasionally Zoom. And, we know that that's not the best way to communicate about really hard subjects.
Yeah. So email and Zoom, but, what are some of the things that you did to try to kind of help get your arms around the flood of emotions? And by the way, I just want to make sure that I'm clear with the listeners that I'm not proclaiming that I did things perfectly or that I am a role model for this. And I just want to make really clear that I'm talking about the struggle and the journey more than the kind of the playbook. Yeah. So, I reached out to our diversity committee and our diversity committee members to get some help with thinking about messaging. I think at that point in time, leaders around the world were feeling that they should make a statement.
And you and I have had some conversations about that, right? Like, what does it mean to make a statement, and who am I to make a statement? But silence speaks volumes as well. So a statement felt really important, yet insufficient, and the imposter syndrome that I had to deal with at that point was huge. So I reached out to diversity committee members to get some help with crafting a message. And I got some really, really helpful feedback from folks who'd been through the advanced diversity certificate that's offered through the Office of Equity. It's actually called the OED, or Office of Equity and Diversity Certificate program at the university. And so that was really helpful to me to get some guidance and coaching from folks who had gone through different kinds of learning than I had gone through. And yet, given the kind of lack of representational diversity at the University of Minnesota, especially within the College of Veterinary Medicine, I was really well aware that we didn't have BIPOC voices represented. And one of the things that I think struck me in sort of reflection shortly thereafter was that, of course, BIPOC folks are going to be impacted differently than majority folks in this kind of event. And so we think a lot when we're doing DEI work about not leaning too heavily on BIPOC folks, but especially in a time like this, when we both need those voices the most, and either those voices may not be available because they're dealing with their own like real-time stuff, depending on where someone lives and how close they were to sort of ground zero of that, and the protests and other social unrest. But also just that's an awful lot to ask. That's an awful lot to ask. But it was really important to me to, once I had more access to talk to some of my BIPOC colleagues that at that time were on the diversity committee, I was able to get a much richer perspective of everything, but also I was able to then find my voice a little bit better about what do I have to contribute here that doesn't feel like, who am I to be the spokesperson?
Yeah. I can imagine that it just kind of, I guess, as a person of color, as an African American, just kind of thinking about what that must be like on the other side. Like, do I send them an email or not? Right? Yeah. Do I pick up the phone or not? I've been pretty open about the fact that I've been doing this work for so long, and yet last summer was, without question, this last year has been the most difficult of my entire career, because the need to balance effectiveness while also trying to deal with your own stuff, right? Your own trauma is hard. So I can imagine that kind of broaching that is challenging. So, one of the things that we certainly talk a lot about in veterinary medicine is well-being. We all know, we all know that well-being is a challenge in veterinary medicine. What did you do to take care of you during that time? For me, taking care of myself when times are tough, which, over the last couple of years have been more often than not, getting outdoors is a survival strategy for me. Getting outdoors, whether it's walking the dogs or just sitting outside when I can sit outside, or I think I remember at that point, actually getting away to do a little bit of camping and just sort of unplugging from things to some extent, while also to another extent staying connected to try to continue to know what was going on and advise on things like, we had to go into reduced operations, because of the
the uncertainty of the sort of safety of clients and staff and faculty as protests kind of moved around the Twin Cities. So it was certainly a balancing act, but I guess that's one of the, if you can say it, silver linings of the pandemic. At that point, I was required to work remotely. And so being physically on campus to be a support wasn't an option, nor would it have been supportive.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, when possible, getting outdoors and sort of reconnecting to nature is sort of my go-to.
So here's a dumb Southerner question. Not that we Southerners are dumb. Don't anybody like start tweeting me or sending me nasty messages, but I'm a Southerner. But so like, how does that work during the winter? Because we are not.
Yeah.
We're not Minnesotans.
Sure. Right. Warm clothing, polar fleece lined pants, and a really nice parka is what you need to get outdoors in the winter at Minnesota. And so I was one of those people who got a pandemic puppy, and she's gotten me outdoors a lot more than I did before the pandemic. So awesome. You gear up and you get outside.
Yeah. All right. I believe you. I believe you. So, not that you can prepare. You can't prepare for things like this. Most crises, you can't prepare for them anyway. You can do that emergency kind of preparedness as much as life allows, but
right.
What kinds of things might you have in place to help the college or other colleges? What kind of recommendations might you make to help folks navigate these crises?
Yeah. Well, part of it is having the right people on your team, having a team with the right positions on it. And that was, so we did not at that point, had not yet hired our Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, Elizabeth Martinez-Podolsky. But the process to navigate to create that position was well underway at that point. But since then, having Elizabeth on the team has made everything so much better. To have a professional who has the experience to be there to help advise me and coach me, but also to help work with others and support others when they're going through whatever the crisis is. And there have been other crises besides the ones you mentioned since then.
Yes.
So it's been really fantastic to have her on the team. With both the DEI expertise and also the higher education administration expertise has been phenomenal. Before Elizabeth was on the team, again, having some sort of community of practice or committee of folks who are doing the work, I'm not an expert. They are often not experts, but that are doing the work and learning along the way is, I think, been really helpful. And we've done that in a couple of ways beyond the diversity committee that we've had since, maybe 2016. So not as long as we should have, but as they say, the best time to plant a tree is 30 years ago and the second best time is today. So having that committee has been really helpful, but also more recently, and maybe it was shortly after the Floyd murder, we convened something that is a group that is our administrative diversity subgroup, meaning it's the dean's leadership team, a subset of that meets regularly to talk about DEI leadership challenges and strategies across the college. And so that's been an additional great step that we started before Elizabeth was hired, and now Elizabeth leads it now that she's in place. But that's been another really helpful asset from the point of view of proactive
Yeah.
planning and reactive when the whatever the thing is happens, to have a group that's already working effectively together, and has some positional authority, to including, folks from across administration. So that's been another helpful strategy. Staying connected to the other resources around campus, our Office of Equity and Diversity. That's been another great. Now, of course, those folks get really busy when one of these things happens. And so I don't mean that in the moment I call them up, because they're trying to help a lot of other people. But to have those relationships and those connections that are ongoing.
Mhm.
And then the other readiness piece is just studying and learning,
Yeah.
reading books, reading articles. We've got opportunities around the college for article clubs and book clubs. And then we have contracted with a local DEI consulting group to provide continuing education for faculty, staff, and students. And because this happened during the pandemic, that's all on Zoom. So it tends to be an evening thing. So not everybody can attend, but most people can attend some of the time.
Yeah. Oh, those are great. So for you, as dean and as a leader, what are some of your own kind of lessons learned that you're willing to share?
Sure. Know what you don't know. Know how to connect with people who do know. Not everybody knows, not anybody probably knows everything, but have that team, have that network. Know that you're not going to get it right, and you're going to have to give yourself some grace. And I don't mean that I think that there was anything horrible that went awry, but I think my thoughts about these responses or these statements is that they're necessary but not sufficient. And so there are times we need to speak out. And there are times where we're not sure if we should speak out, because there's stuff happening all over the place all the time, right? But one of the things that I've really done with some intention is to think about how to weave the messages that reinforce my leadership values over time in my messages. So it isn't a reactive message because this bad thing just happened. Well, it's both. We do need to react when a bad thing happens, especially something that directly affects our community, whether that's because it's locally or because of some other connection. But I think it's really important, as any leader who's committed to culture change would probably agree, it's really important that this messaging be consistent over time and reinforcing. So it is clear that, I mean it, that this really does matter to me, and that this is something that I'm committed to advancing the work of DEI at the college, not single-handedly, not as an expert, but with others, shoulder to shoulder, and keeping that in the spotlight, even when there isn't something externally prompting it. Yeah. Such important things. And I really there are two things, I guess, that I think I wanted to note. Well, three, actually. One, so book clubs and journal clubs, awesome. So here's my shameless plug for AAVMC's community read. Yeah, there you go.
My shameless plug. We're currently reading Why Do All the Black Kids Sit in the Cafeteria Together, about racial identity development. So always great to hear those kinds of things. And this idea that statements are necessary but insufficient, right? And I think that the duality of that gets lost on folks. And it's one of those things where if you don't do a statement, you're definitely going to get crushed. If you do a bad statement, it might actually be worse than not doing a statement. But not doing a statement is not really an option, right?
Yeah.
And so there's this kind of really weird continuum that you're trying to hit the right sweet spot where you are reflecting those core values, but also recognizing and acknowledging for folks, I just want to acknowledge that these things happen and that folks are hurting, and that, especially with the world the way it is, there may be limited opportunities to fix this, like, right?
Right.
Or to actually just meet you where you are physically and emotionally. And so I think that those things are really important. And then that final piece, Laura, about, making sure that all along the way, well before, crises emerge, because they do daily. So it's just most of them are smaller,
or distant,
right? But I think that a lot of us talk about values, but we don't talk about what they look like or what they sound like or what they feel like. But if folks are really consistent, we still might not be able to describe it, but we know it when we see it, hear it, and read it, right? And so it's really, really important for folks to establish those core values and adhere, like constantly be a mirror reflecting. All right, so now that a year has passed, we're also months past the trial verdict, the sentencing, that's all kind of wrapped up. Things, of course, are still happening related to the Floyd case in particular. There's just always kind of churning things kind of happening. But how are things on campus? Have you just moved on to new crises?
To some extent. I mean, I was going to say news cycle, but it's really the attention cycle kind of shifts from time to time. And right now, I would say over the last few months, our students have been more focused on concerns about student mental health services, with some restructuring that we've been doing at the college, and with the increased need and demand for student mental health services across higher education, right? We're not unique there. But that has been more of the student focus over the last few months. But yeah, I mean, the learning about all sorts of DEI issues, topics, concerns continues across the college through these various groups, some of which are more grassroots groups and some of which are more kind of official committee type groups. So conversations about race continue for sure, even though student mental health maybe has taken the center stage in recent months.
Great. Well, I really appreciate you taking some time to talk about these things, because I just remember in the days after that all I could think about was, well, not all I could think about, I thought I was thinking about a lot of things, but with respect specifically to, the College of Veterinary Medicine is, wow, they just went through a version of this a few years ago. And now this one is, and I do think that the fact that the Twin Cities had just kind of gone through something like this and a few years ago, that it made the death of George Floyd that much more attention grabbing, right? Because the cities had just gone through something similar. But I really appreciate you taking some time and hoping that you and all of your dean colleagues navigate all the crises that you deal with on a daily basis as well.
We're all grateful to have you on Bat Phone. You've been a phenomenal resource over many years for both certainly for crises, but also for just garden variety challenges and for opportunities and kind of coaching and advising us along the way. And I feel like, that has made a big difference in where we are in 2021 versus where we were in 2016. Yeah. And I don't mean to claim any, major triumphs, but I would claim that there's been a much deeper and broader focus on DEI issues. And, it's great to have someone like you at AAVMC there to help coach us from the sidelines or sometimes front and center.
Oh, well, thank you. And I just have to shout out, Laura made one of my dreams come true. Sadly, it was like after the worst possible thing. But the last time I was in Minnesota, she took me to Paisley Park so that I could properly pay my respects to Prince. Thank you. Like that meant a lot to me.
Next time you're in town, we'll have to go back because Paisley Park is, back then it was more kind of paying respect at a distance at a chain link fence. And now there are more opportunities to connect kind of more intimately.
I'm so there. So thank you. Thank you. It's great to end on a positive note. So this has been another episode of AAVMC's Diversity and Inclusion on Air. To my guest, Dean Molgaard, thank you very much for joining me for this chat today. Be sure to subscribe to the podcast on your favorite podcast app, and be sure to like us on our Facebook page, which is AAVMC's Diversity and Inclusion on Air. And stay tuned. We'll be back in a few weeks. Thanks for listening.
Thank you.